The latest of the Canadian TSC educational series. The series was created to support individuals and families affected by TSC by offering expert-led sessions on topics that matter to the Canadian TSC community. So really the goal is to share practical information and resources to help families navigate the complexities of TSC and providing a space to connect and ask questions. So just a bit about the committee. It's led by a dedicated committee of healthcare professionals. So Maria Zach from Sick Kids, Dr. Robin Whitney from McMaster, Dr. Mariam Nabavi Nouri from London Health Sciences Centre, and Dr. Mark Kieser from CHUM. And for those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Cote. I live in Ottawa with my two daughters, and my connection to this community began when my oldest was diagnosed with TSC at the age of 1. So, like many of you, I was looking for support and information, and I really am grateful to be part of a community that's working to improve care and awareness across Canada. So tonight's session will focus on strategies for supporting behavioral challenges related to TSC in school settings, and we'll also cover access programs and education-related resources. So I am pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Flynn. Jennifer is a school principal with a doctorate in educational leadership from Western University. Her research focused on chronic health conditions, education policy, and inclusion. And her earlier work looked at educational impacts of TSC, which is both a personal and professional interest as her daughter Katie lives with the condition. She has served on the TSC Canada Board of Directors since 2008. She's a member of the International Tandem Consortium, and she's the author of Princess Katie the Brave, which is a children's book that's inspired by her daughter's journey. So thank you, Jennifer, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Melissa. And thank you so much for the invite to be here tonight. I think, it's so important to have these opportunities to talk about things that are relevant to our TSC community and to families and individuals that have TSC. So we'll kind of jump right in. Hopefully we can share some good information, and then there'll be opportunity for lots of questions at the end. So if you have specific things you want to ask, absolutely, hopefully we'll have time for that. So Melissa, I'll get you to, or who's sharing my slides now? We can go to the next slide. All right, great. So of course, this audience is quite familiar with tuberous sclerosis complex, but just as a very top level overview, of course, TSC affects approximately 1 in 6,000 people. It's a multi-system disorder, which is highly variable. And of course, that means that people may have many different organ systems that are impacted and lots of impacts from tuberous sclerosis, or they may have just a little bit of impact. And every single individual with TSC is different and has kind of a different combination of things that might be challenges. And as well as the physical challenges, which we all know well, most individuals with TSC are also impacted by behavioral, intellectual, neuropsychological, psychiatric, and intellectual difficulties. And these difficulties are actually what all families and individuals report cause the greatest burden. So when we're thinking about actually living with TSC, the things that are the most challenging reported by caregivers and families are all of these other manifestations of TSC. So all of these other sort of non-physical manifestations are what we refer to as the TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders, or TAND. And we have this great graphic here that the TAND Consortium put together, and it's an umbrella that shows all of these different aspects of TSC, and it just kind of breaks them down into clusters. So we can think about an individual who has TSC as potentially having some or even all of these different levels of neuropsychiatric disorders. So we have some behavioral issues that can be quite common in TSC, things like aggression, temper tantrums, self-injury, impulsivity, repetitive behavior, sleep issues. These can all fall under that behavioral level. We have the psychiatric level, so things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, anxiety disorder, depressive disorder. So these are disorders that are diagnosed in an individual. We have the intellectual level, and this is where we look at things like intellectual disability or uneven intellectual profiles. So an individual might have some areas that they have more skill and then some areas that are definitely less proficient in. And then my kind of area and the part of the TAND consortium that I work on is the academic level. So this is where we look at an individual might have difficulty in reading, writing, spelling, mathematics. So all of those kinds of traditional school skills that we think about. This is where an individual with TSC might have some challenges. Then we have our neuropsychological level. So this cluster look at things like sustained attention, dual tasking, memory, working memory, kind of that cognitive flexibility. And then finally, we have psychosocial. So we have things like self-esteem, self-efficacy. This is where we take into account parental stress and relationship difficulties. So if we look at this whole umbrella, we have that one section that's focused on those academic issues, but really all of these aspects of TAND can have a major impact on a child and their school experience. So all of these different levels can definitely impact, you know, how they're functioning in school, how successful they are in school. These can all be things that we want to really look out for when we have a child that's school aged. So here, kind of just taking some of those pieces out of that umbrella, if we think about those educational impacts of TSC. So in the general population, of course, we have many children who have lots of these challenges as well. But we think about the general population and you think about ADHD and how that might impact someone in school. So they might have difficulty paying attention. They might be hyperactive. And these are all things that are very, very common in TSC. Autism spectrum disorder, of course, again, this is a spectrum. So you might have an individual who's very impacted by autism, or you might have an individual that is much higher functioning with autism spectrum disorder. Anxiety is quite common. And then intellectual disability. So when we're looking at an intellectual disability, we're really looking at their overall intellectual ability. So we can have things like a mild intellectual disability. So that means that overall, the person's intellectual ability is lower than what we would expect in the average general population, but they can still be very, high functioning, and these individuals could eventually learn to live on their own. They might need some supports, but they can still, certainly do a lot of things in school and do a lot of things. And then again, this is a bit of a spectrum as well. We will also have some individuals that have a more profound intellectual disability. So these individuals, might be working more on communication, or might need a lot more support looking forward into the future. So intellectual disability is quite common. So we have in TSC, we have about half of the individuals that are going to be average or even above average in their intellectual functioning. And then half of the individuals are going to have an intellectual disability, and quite a population of those will be quite a profound intellectual disability. Then we move into something called learning disability. So this is different than intellectual disability. With an intellectual disability, we're kind of looking at that overall intellectual functioning that's lower. I mean, of course, they can have pockets, but it's lower. With a learning disability, this is something really specific. So this could be an individual who may even have average or even above average intelligence overall, but they have a challenge in a very specific area. Could be math, or it could be language, or there could be a couple of areas in there. So this is where you hear people talk about things like dyslexia, or dyscalculia if they have a difficulty with math, or dysgraphia if they really have a very specific issue with spelling and other skills around that. So an individual with a learning disability, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of their intellectual functioning is lower, but they do have a skill that's really difficult for them. And then we have, social challenges that can certainly be very challenging, very difficult when you have a child who's in school who has TSC. So we think of all of these other things like autism spectrum disorder that can make it really hard to relate socially. And autism is quite prevalent in TSC. It's about 50% of people with TSC will also be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. So that can make it really difficult to understand some of those social cues or to create those social relationships can be a little more difficult. People with ADHD as well, their social skills tend to be a little bit delayed. So they might be, a little bit behind their age mates in terms of understanding how to create those relationships or to problem solve in those social situations, or even to just understand the subtleties of those social relationships. And then we also have, of course, missed school just due to the health aspects. So when we think about those physical aspects of TSC, they certainly also have an impact on the school experience. So we know, as parents, there are many, many appointments with many different specialists, and that can definitely have an impact as well, just on that whole kind of school experience. So these are some of the things that can be certainly challenging for an individual who has TSC and who's at school. So what we're looking at obviously is a very complex disorder, which I certainly don't need to tell this audience. It's a very complex disorder. But what we do need to realize as parents is that the schools are not going to know about it. And so it's our job and it's your job to educate the teachers, the special education teachers, and others that are working with your child really about what your child needs to be successful. So schools are going to be very familiar with a lot of those components that we were just talking about. So they're definitely very well versed in working with children who have ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities, all of those different parts under that big umbrella, they're going to be quite familiar with. But TSC itself adds a whole other layer of complexity. And so you do want to make sure that you help your school to learn a little bit about it and how they're going to best meet your child's needs. So now I want to talk a little bit about just class placements. So this is going to vary, of course, depending on what is offered in your particular school board in your district. But there's different kinds of placements that might be suggested for your child. This is all going to depend on what your child needs. And we know every individual with TSC is different and has a different, different strengths and needs. And this is not to say that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just thinking about what's going to be most supportive for your child. So at the top there, we have regular class with indirect support. And we often talk about trying to place children in the least restrictive environment. So we're trying to place children, if possible, in the most kind of typical setting, but really always come back to if that's appropriate for your child. Is that the best spot for your child? So a regular class with indirect support just means that they're in a community school, they're with their age mates, and the indirect support might be the special education teacher might consult with the classroom teacher around how to program for your child. So, things that they might need to support their learning. Then we have like a regular class with some resource assistance. So in some schools, the resource teacher or special education teacher might come into the class and might work directly with the class or with the student. Some schools offer a regular class placement with some withdrawal assistance. So your child is maybe going to be in the regular classroom with their age mates most of the time, but then there are times when they're pulled out. Maybe they're working with a small group, or maybe they're working one-on-one with an educator or an educational assistant. Then we have special education classes. So in some schools and in some districts, they may have a segregated special education class. Sometimes that comes with partial integration, or sometimes that's a full-time placement. And again, it's going to depend on what your child needs and what you really envision for them. What do you want to see their kind of experience be? So they might be partially integrated, so they might spend a lot of time in a special education placement and then maybe go and join their age mates for certain part of the day. Sometimes it can be things like art or phys ed or some other kind of part of the day that they might really enjoy. And then the other parts of the day, they might be working on their special programming in their special education class. And then again, in some cases, it's a special education class full-time. And I just really want to stress that it's not to say that one is necessarily better than the other. It depends on what your vision is and what is going to suit your child best. No matter where they are and no matter what their needs are, it's important to think about what kind of programming they're going to be getting. So I really like this. We use this in my particular board, this response to intervention model. So the way this works is, the way to think about it is tier 1 is at the top. And this is what most children are going to learn from. So this is good quality classroom instruction. So the teacher is offering solid programming. They're using good resources that are research-based. The teachers are offering check-ins and feedback. And most individuals are going to be successful here. Then we have tier 2, and this is less students. So this is like some students, they need some additional supports or programming in order to be successful. So a little bit of extra support. And again, that could be a pull-out model or somebody coming in. And then we have tier 3. Tier 3 is our highest level of specialized intervention. So this is for that small number of students that really need something more intensive, research-based, in order to be successful. So I like to think about reading with this particular model. So at the top, that's the teachers teaching the kids in the class, and they're all learning to read together, and most kids are going to be able to be successful. The tier 2 might be, okay, the child's going to benefit from that, but they're also going to need something a little bit extra. So they're going to be maybe pulled out and run a little bit of an extra program. And then tier 3 are going to be those students that really are not going to be able to learn to read with the rest of the children. They're going to need something much more specific to help them read. And there's lots of great programs for that. The one we use in our board is called Empower. It's like a research-based program, and the students move through it, and it's like very kind of directed, but it's based on research, so we know it's really effective. So, kind of on that note, it's important to think about IEPs, individualized education plans. Many children and students who have TSC will benefit from an IEP. And an IEP can certainly cover academic, physical, social, sometimes health and behavioral needs. These can be part of your child's IEP. Parents and guardians can have input into the IEP. So you want to really be part of this process. Active role. Maybe can I get Diana to mute your microphone, please? Oh, perfect. So you really want to take an active role in this and read it carefully. The big idea here is that IEPs are meant to be working documents. So they're meant to be live documents that if something is not working, it can be changed. And we have set points during the year where we send them home or we assess them and things like that. But that doesn't mean that you're stuck with that IEP until that reporting period. If something needs to be added or needs to be taken out, that's where you really want to connect with the school, and you can make those updates at any time. So in the IEP, two of the biggest things that you're going to see are accommodations or modifications. If we're looking at an accommodation, we're really making changes that help with the learning. So they're learning the same thing as the rest of their age mates, but they might need a little bit extra time, for example, or they might need access to a computer or some other assisted device, or it could be a seat close to the teacher. When you're looking at modifications, you're actually changing what the child is learning. So when we're looking at the curriculum and the curriculum expectations, they might be learning um, less complex curriculum expectations, or there might be less expectations. So modifications are changing what they're learning, and accommodations are changing how they're learning it. And I think on the next slide, I have some examples of what that might look like. Okay, so accommodations. So here's some really common accommodations we use with many students that can really help their learning. So they just might need a seat closer to the teacher. So we think of that whole kind of distractibility, executive function, ADHD, students that have difficulties like that. A seat close to the teacher, that can be a really easy accommodation. It could be access to technology. So a lot of times we have students that will use like a speech to text, or even like a special type of a spell check or predictive text while they're typing. Chunking assignments. So when we have a big assignment, some of our children who struggle with executive function and with that kind of planning and mapping things out, a big assignment can be quite overwhelming to them. So sometimes an easy accommodation is to break it into pieces for them. Extra time to complete an assignment. Those are all accommodations. We haven't changed what the child is learning. We're just giving them some supports to learn it. In the middle, this is where we have our modifications. So here we're really taking the curriculum and we're changing it for that child. So for example, we might be looking at content from a previous grade. So if the child's in grade 5, but they're still solidifying their understanding of mathematical concepts from grade 2, we could have some expectations on their IEP from grade 2, and that's what they're going to work on. Sometimes it's a matter of fewer expectations, kind of focused on those big ideas. So we're not worried about all those little specifics, but big idea. Simplifying the expectations. So for example, if the rest of the class has to write a 2-page essay, maybe they're only writing 1 page. So we're just simplifying it a bit. Oftentimes on an IEP under a modification, this is where you'll see an exemption from standardized testing. So in Ontario, we have EQAO testing that students write at certain points. They might not have to write it based on their IEP. And then again, simplified text that they might be reading or simplified story. With all the AI tools available now, this is really easy for the teacher to take, let's say, a science text that everybody's reading. They can put it into AI and say, make this several reading grades lower, simpler. And then the child can get kind of the same, again, big idea, but the words are going to be simpler. The text is going to be simpler to understand. And then in the last column here, we have alternative programs. So sometimes we need something in the IEP that's not related at all to the curriculum. So we're not accommodating the curriculum. We're not modifying the curriculum. We have a totally separate program for this particular child. And a lot of times this is where you'll see something around behavior. So we know behavior problems are quite common in TSC. So this is where we might have a whole page, an alternative program page about a specific behavior goal and about how we're going to try and reach that goal. What is the goal? What's it going to look like? How are we going to get the child there? Sometimes I have seen a health procedure in an alternate program. Self-care goals, that's a good example of an alternative program. So if we have a child who's really working on their toileting skills, for example, and they might be much older, but that is a goal for them, that would be an alternative page that we might have on there. So they're going to indicate, for example, when they need to use the washroom. I've got a couple other just really simple, like larger set of objects compared to a smaller set of objects. So they're just kind of, trying to point instead of sort of speaking. So those are just some examples of, things you might see on an IEP. And then I wanted to touch on just, and this would be something you would see in an IEP as well, but alternative communication systems. So one of the ones that we use a lot is a picture exchange system, or PECS. Um, so this is where we have a child or an individual who's not able to verbally communicate, but they can learn to use a PECS system where they have some pictures of desired items, and they can learn to kind of point to the desired items in order to express something that they want or need. So it actually uses physical picture cards, and that makes it kind of really easy to implement. It's a very structured program though, and the school would work through this, but they have, multiple phases they go through where they start with really simple exchanges based on really motivating things. So for some individuals, for example, if they're very food motivated and they have a special food that they really like, you might start with PECs about that food. So it's a picture of that food item, and that's what they're going to start with their communication is. They're going to go and get that or point to it, and that's going to indicate they want that food item. And then eventually you kind of move out to more complex and more abstract things. It's really functional, but it helps individuals initiate requests and, kind of talk about their needs. And we have students in our school who wear it around their neck on a lanyard, and they've got like a little thing with their PECS board. And then as they're walking around the school, I can have an exchange with them, and they can, point to something like they're going to the bathroom, and they can point to that. And so that's something that you might see on an IEP. And depending on the needs of your child, that could be something that they might work towards. I just threw in a couple of pictures here of different communication boards that are sometimes used with PECs. So again, simple little pictures. And then on the other side, you see a little booklet with the Velcro strips. And a lot of times they'll use it that way. Sometimes the teachers will or the educator, whoever it is, will lay out a series of things, and they can understand that they're working through that. Sometimes you start with actual photographs of the item as well, depending on, if those abstract ones are going to be more difficult to understand, but then you kind of move to the more abstract images. So just, thinking about those members on the team, um, the teacher is usually the one who's in charge of like the programming for a child, but then we also have special education teachers. In our board, we call them resource teachers. They're definitely one of the most important members of your team. So they're going to be either helping the classroom teacher with writing the IEP, or in some cases they write it. They often will coordinate all the paraprofessionals that might be involved. They're going to work with the classroom teacher often around how to support your child. And so you really want to make sure you're providing both them and the classroom teacher with any information that's needed. Another really, really important individual that could be involved with your child is an educational assistant. And again, this is going to vary by board, by district, what is provided. But sometimes an educational assistant, so a paraprofessional, might be supporting your child. So they might be supporting multiple children in a room who have some special education needs, or they might be assigned just to one child, depending on their needs. And their role is really to support your child to reach their goals. So they're going to work under the direction of the classroom teacher or the special education teacher. So the teachers are always going to be the ones that are going to provide the programming, but then the EA might be the one who's implementing the programming. So super, super important. And can be, a really key member of the team, especially depending on if your child has more extensive needs. This could be a really, really important member of your team. And then there's lots of other paraprofessionals that might be involved. And again, it's going to depend on the needs. So you might have educational psychologists, you might have a psychoeducational assessment done, occupational therapists, speech therapists, physical therapists. They're all important, and it very much depends on your district how much support you get from these various individuals. Some people will access these privately if they have some coverage through their work. In some boards, they might have some of these individuals work right in the school. Some boards, these individuals might come in occasionally and consult with the teacher or special education teacher, but can also definitely be an important part of your team. And if we're thinking about, all of those different things we talked about at the beginning, these people can really support a lot of that. I think the most important thing is trying to work with your school. So open communication is going to be the most important thing, whatever the needs are. So if behavior is the biggest challenge, you really want to be open and connected with the school. Providing lots of information about your child, information about TSC. If there's something that comes up that's not working well, reach out to the teacher or the resource teacher. You can always call for a team meeting. And I think that's something important for parents to know. Sometimes we have these certain times of the year where we're going to meet to talk about a child's progress, but you can always call for a team meeting. If there's something that's not going well, just call the school and call for a team meeting, and they will definitely meet with you and connect with you. Don't be afraid to be an advocate for your child. So remember that you know your child best. Certainly, the school is going to be the educational expert, but you know your child best. And so don't be afraid to take an active role. I put this in here. This was a chart I developed a couple of years ago. I put this in here because one of the things that's important to think about, no matter where your child is and what their challenges are, you want to think about those transitions and timelines. So I kind of put this together to think about, if your child's in elementary school, what kinds of things might you be needing to look at? If they're in middle school, when they're in high school, if they move past high school and they're going, to world of work or to post-secondary or wherever they might be going, you want to kind of make sure that you're doing all these things early. So even in elementary school, depending on your child's abilities, early on, start to help them recognize, what do they like? What do they dislike? Have those conversations about the future. For the school, they're going to build that IEP in collaboration with the family. They're going to coordinate the school-based supports. Community, this is where you want to maybe start connecting with community recreation activities. If you look in sort of middle school, you're going to be continuing to learn about themselves. They're going to start to advocate. It's never too early to help your child start to learn to advocate for themselves. And it can be as simple as just knowing something that they need to really help them. You're going to want to start getting on certain wait lists, for example. So, you're going to be exploring community agencies that can help facilitate transitions, community living, advocacy, all those things. So this is just kind of an overview of some of those things that you want to think about. When they're in high school, one thing that's important to note, when your child is approaching later high school, if your child is going to be going to a college or university, so some kind of post-secondary, you want to make sure that their latest psychological testing, so their, psychoeducational assessments, are up to date. They need to be 2 years old or less in order for the college or the university to use them to give them whatever modifications or accommodations that they're going to need. So oftentimes when people go off to post-secondary, if they do have some kind of a special education need, they can still get things at the university like extra time or a quiet space, for example, to write an exam, different things like that. So you want to make sure that you've planned ahead and had any of that kind of testing updated within 2 years of them leaving high school, if that's a path for them. And of course, depending on the needs of your child, a child who has more significant intellectual involvement can stay, at least in Ontario, can stay in high school until age 21 if they have some more needs. So you can plan for that as well, and that can be a great place for them to stay until they're 21, and then it gives you a little more time to plan for after high school and where in the community can they go and what kind of agency can be involved with them. And really that's it. I put a couple of resources in here, but I mean, there's lots more resources and I can certainly add more. But I just kind of threw a couple of resources in there, but that's really it for me. So I'm hoping there's some questions or yeah, we'll open it up to the floor.